I'm Naomi Smith, one of the two student leaders at Birkbeck Student Union, and I'm joined by the head of Birkbeck's UCU branch for a question and answer about everything that's been going on with the UCU lately, the strikes, which you may have heard about, and lastly, how that is going to impact on you guys, on the students. So thank you for joining me, Tanya. If you want to introduce yourself and let students know who you are.
Yep. All right. So thank you for taking the time to talk. My name's Taya Serisier. So I work in criminology at Birkbeck. So we're in the law school department there. And as you said, I'm also the president of the local branch of UCU, which is the Universities and Colleges Union. So the way it works is quite similar to NUS. We are a national union, so the general secretary of our union, who you may see on the news sometimes, is Joe Grady. Then every branch, which we have a branch at pretty much all universities, as well as many colleges and other kind of post-secondary education institutions, has its own structures and will have its own kind of committee and chair and president who operate a bit like the local student union. So, and we represent our members. We have kind of regular meetings. They feed into us. We work back and forth with the national union, and we also work on local issues here.
Cool. Thank you, and thank you for being here and agreeing to talk to us today. So starting off, could you just give me a sort of a brief overview of the issues that UCU has been balloting on and why these are important to lecturers and students in the sector in general?
Yeah. So the first thing that we always need to say is we do have a lot of lecturers, but the union also represents staff who aren't engaged in teaching. So support staff and other staff who work at the university as well. Okay, so it gets a little bit complicated. So we currently have just concluded a ballot on two separate disputes. So the first one of them is a dispute about pensions. And the reason that they're two separate disputes is they involve two different groups of employers. So there's an organization called Universities UK, which really represents what we often refer to as the pre-92 or the kind of older universities. And Birkbeck is one of those. Now, that organization essentially runs its own pension scheme, which is different to the pension scheme of the post-92s or the newer universities. So that pension scheme is called the University Superannuation Scheme, or USS. And we are going into dispute over the pension scheme because just at the end of the pandemic this summer, and I'll talk a little bit about how the pandemic's been for us in a moment, Universities UK announced that they were implementing a series of cuts to our pension. So essentially, on average, staff members in the pension scheme are going to lose about 35% of their pension. And to put that in context, for someone like me who works in London and, will be retiring hopefully in kind of, 30 years, say, my annual pension is estimated to go down from 17,000 to 9,000 pounds a year. So essentially, that means on what I get annually, I would no longer be able to afford to live in London. We get a pot of money at the end when we retire, but essentially that pot of money will be eaten into just even by paying rent, as we move forward. So it's a significant cut in the pension. Now, the reasons that this is happening, and it gets a little bit complicated, but I think the simplest way of explaining it is that the pension scheme did what's called a valuation, which is where they look at, the scheme, they look at its investments, they look at how healthy it is. They did that valuation in March 2020. Now, the problem with that is March 2020 is actually the exact month in which all the markets collapsed just after the pandemic hit. So if you look at a graph, and I can send one through to you later, if you look at a graph of the actual pension findings, it kind of goes like this for March 2020 from where it was before, and then it goes back up again. So we're being told our pensions have to be cut because a valuation was taking place essentially at the worst possible time. And many institutions, including the management at Birkbeck, have agreed that the valuation is ridiculous, it needs to be redone. If the valuation were redone, then there wouldn't be the same logic for cutting our pensions. Our problem is that there's a set of decisions that were taken in the summer that are going to come into effect in April, which will mean those pension cuts are gone. Now, so that's the kind of immediate thing. This comes at the end of a series of cuts to the pensions, which have been going on for 10 years. So from the time, I'm from Australia, from the time that I arrived in the UK, the pension scheme is already significantly worse than it was when I first arrived, to the extent that many kind of junior, lower paid, precarious staff aren't really in the pension because it doesn't offer them anything. So for us, there's kind of there's an immediate issue, which is we want the cuts to be frozen, for there to be an agreement basically that it doesn't make sense to cut our pensions irreversibly on the basis of that valuation. And then for us to work with the employers to actually make the scheme sustainable and make it so that younger staff can come into the pension. So that's a kind of longer term thing, because we do have a set of meetings, regular meetings between UCU and the employers where we manage the pension. And what's happened in the summer is that they refuse to consider our proposals. They rush through their proposals. These series of cuts are going to come in. We just want to put a hold on those cuts. We want to bring them back in the room. We want a new valuation. So that's the pensions. The second dispute that we're involved in is with an organization called UCU. And that is the Universities and Colleges Educational Association, I think. And sometimes I get the E wrong, but I can look it up for you and check. Now, UCU is a bigger organization, so that involves pretty much every university in the country, including the kind of newer universities. Now, that dispute is around what we call the four fights. And what that is one of them is pay. So we have a pay claim. Over the last decade, we've lost 20% of our pay in real terms. And that's particularly a problem for people who are on casualized contracts who earn very low amounts of money. So many people can no longer afford to live, especially if they work in somewhere like London, simply by working at a university. So many of our members who are on casualized contracts, will also work in a bar, also work somewhere else because they simply can't afford to live on that pay. And that's the second element of the four fights, is it's about precarity and casualization. Again, in the last decade, we've seen casualization grow to the extent where the majority of teaching done at universities in the UK is done by staff who aren't on permanent contracts. We're going to talk about students in a bit, but that's incredibly bad for students because it means that their teaching is being delivered by people who are extremely low paid, who often aren't paid for all of the work that they do, and who have no promise of secure employment, who aren't able to be, invested in, people who study for years and years. So we want a change to that. We want to reduce the amount of casualization in the sector. The third element is equalities. So the university sector has huge pay inequalities around gender, has huge pay inequalities around race, and it has huge pay inequalities around disability. And what we want is for employers to work with us to change that. And you will notice at Birkbeck, at other institutions, part of it is structural. If you look at the really kind of senior, well-paid academic staff, they tend to be men, they tend to be white. You don't see many academic staff members with disabilities. Our sector needs to change so that it's more fair and it's more reflective of Britain as a whole, and particularly at places like Birkbeck, of the students that we teach. And the final element is workload. And what you find there is that staff in universities, and this isn't just academics, it's also professional and support staff, tend to work an average of about 20 hours more than they're paid for if they're on full-time permanent contracts, and they often work hours and hours more than they're paid for if they're on casual contracts. So essentially, the university sector is run on people doing large amounts of unpaid work. Academics don't tend to have weekends. Increasingly, professional and support staff don't tend to do that. It's very common for people to work extremely long days, for people to work weekends. And one of the things that we've seen over the past couple of years is that's gotten even worse during the pandemic. So, you know, where we used to talk to our members and they would say things like, you know, I can only do my research, or I can only catch up on my marking on the weekends in the evening because I've got so much else on. Now they say, you know, even when I work the weekends and the evenings, I can't keep up with everything. I can't catch up. You know, I can't rest. I mean, the kind of slogan that we're using for the strike, for the 4 fights, is we're at breaking point. And if you actually talk to the people who work at the university, your lecturers, administrators, that's what people will say to you, that they just don't feel that they can work in the way that they're working anymore, that it's not healthy, that it's not sustainable. And I think importantly, we can't deliver the kind of support that we want to deliver for students because the workloads are simply too high. So that was a long answer, but that's, you know, that's the reasons.
Cool, thank you. So moving on to sort of, you know, what's happening now. Could you tell us sort of what was the outcome of the ballot, both at Birkbeck and nationally, and then sort of what happens next, to the extent that you can, you know, tell us sort of what are the next steps, what can we expect within the next sort of couple of months?
Yeah, okay, so basically I mentioned this in relation to pensions, but in both of the disputes over the summer, the negotiations broke down. And essentially what happened is the employers, you know, said, we're not talking to you anymore. That's it. After that happened, the union issues a letter of dispute to the employers. And from that position, we ran a ballot. So we ran a ballot with all staff across the country, and that concluded at the end of last week. We got the results. So we ran 2 ballots, one for each dispute. What happened was that we asked staff, are you prepared to take strike action in this dispute, and are you prepared to take action short of a strike? And action short of a strike can be a number of things. The most common thing is that we refuse to work extra hours anymore. That's the kind of most basic form of action short of a strike. We say, we are only working, you know, if I'm paid for 35 hours a week, that's all I'll work. Now, in both disputes, nationally, there was a majority vote in favour of strike action and in favour of action short of a strike. And that was the same at Birkbeck. So we need to get 50% of staff or more to vote, and we did, and we need to have a vote in favour, and we did. So at Birkbeck, we had about 60-something% members of the union vote. We had 75% vote in favour of strike action and 82 to 3% vote in favour of action short of a strike. And that was very similar to the votes nationally. And so that's what next. So what happens now is branches across the country, including Birkbeck, need to come together and think about what we want to do next. And then we feed that back into the national union. We have a higher education committee in the union, and they make a plan. And really the kind of question that we're asking is, what can we do to most effectively get the employers to agree to come back into the room with us, to restart serious negotiations so that we can call off the dispute, you know, we can go back to teaching and working, and, you know, we can solve these problems in negotiations, which is the way that we would prefer to solve them.
Sure, thank you. And so what does this mean for students over the next sort of few months? And also, as you sort of mentioned earlier, still talking about students, in terms of, you know, the issues that are that this is sort of about, how do those impact on students as well? Like, what if the union is successful, what would that look like? I suppose what would students see in terms of a change?
All right. So I think it's
big questions, I know.
Yeah. I might start with the second bit first. I mean, one of the things we say, you know, that you'll see kind of, you know, over the next few months is people saying, you know, our working conditions are your learning conditions. And, you know, and what that means is currently universities are not operating the way that they should because of the high numbers of casualized staff, because of overwork, because people don't have the time to do their job properly. And that affects everything. So when you're taught by predominantly casualized staff, you're taught by people who aren't properly paid to put in the preparation work that's needed for them to deliver your classes. When you come to a university like Birkbeck, one of the things we promise, and that is important, is that you get, research-led teaching, that you get taught by people who are experts, who use their own research and the researches of others to feed into the material that they give you. And we have, amazing teaching at Birkbeck, but when you're taught by a casualized member of staff, they're only paid a very small amount of money to prepare for the class. So they're paid essentially kind of to do 2 hours preparation work for a 1 hour class. And that includes preparation, it includes all emails and communication with students about the class. It includes, the marking that they do through term. It includes responding to student feedback. So when you break it down that way, and the thing is, most casualized staff do a lot more work than that. They're not paid for it, but it's not enough to deliver the kind of education that we want to deliver for students. And the same thing happens for staff who are on permanent contracts. Because the workloads are so high, we don't get to put the time into teaching that we want. So it affects the preparation of classes, it affects the amount of time that people can spend on things like marking, and it affects the related things too. Like particularly at Birkbeck, a lot of students really struggled over the last year. I mean, you would be well aware of this, and the ability of the institution to support those students, even beyond delivering quality education, was really damaged by workloads, by casualization. And this is why it's important not just to talk about lecturers as well, so it's things like really long waiting lists for counselling, it's things like making sure that disability support plans are put into place, quickly, that staff get communicated with about them, that staff have time to respond to them, that, if I find out that I have a student in my class who's in crisis, for instance, I had a number of students who caught COVID in the pandemic, have had, problems with their housing in the pandemic. My ability to offer them support, to find other people in the college who can also offer them support, who have the time to, plus to do all the other things that I have to do in my job, is really hampered by the fact that I am expected to do far too many things in the week. So, I've talked to people and we talk about, staying up all night, worrying about our students, but not being able, that you have to cut corners somewhere. And it's, it's not just us, it's counselling staff, it's staff in student support, it's the departmental, and school-based administrators who, and I know students often get frustrated, they say, I send an email, it takes a really long time for people to get back to me. We hear that all the time. That's because people are incredibly overworked. We are all here at this institution, particularly at Birkbeck, because we support the mission, we believe in the mission of, providing an education to diverse groups of working Londoners. And we want the time, the ability to do that, the working conditions that let us do that effectively. So, sorry, I get very impassioned, I got caught up on that. So how the strikes, and potential action short of strike will affect students. I mean, the thing is, that we have to say it will affect students. And this is something that we always struggle with. The main way that we have of taking industrial action, it's like, I mean, it's kind of it's obviously a different context, but when tube drivers go on strike, for instance, that affects commuters, obviously. They don't do it because they hate commuters and because they want to, make everyone's lives more difficult. They do it because that's the only way they have to make their employers listen to them. And that is the same with us. When we go on strike and when we take action short of a strike, we don't only target the things that directly impact students, but it does also affect the things that impact students. So if we take a strike day and you have a class, the class won't be held. If we're working to contract and we don't have time to get the marking done, which, as I said, people often are doing that on the weekends and at nighttime. It's going to take a lot longer for the marks to come back. So it's those kinds of things. So it will affect students. And the reason is because we want to draw attention to the fact that the way, and it's not just Birkbeck, it's across the sector, these are, national problems. The way that things are operating is unsustainable. It doesn't provide a quality education for students, but essentially no one is listening to us. And the way that we make people pay attention is to take industrial action. And it's something that we never do lightly. And, the other thing that's worth pointing out is we will, as we always do, take measures to try to provide alternate ways of interacting with students. So at Birkbeck and many other institutions, whenever we take strike days, we hold kind of alternate university events. So people will, give talks or conduct workshops on the picket lines, talking about, their research, the things they do. It's not technically classes, but we have a lot of students come along, and so we still engage, in different forms of teaching, learning, workshops, interacting with students, because that's what we want to do. That's what we're here for. But we do it, we do these things in a way that disrupts the institutions to the extent that we try and get them to come back to the bargaining table with us. Feel free to ask any more specific questions, but that's the impact. And we're doing it to have a short-term impact in order actually to make university education better for students in the long term.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's very helpful. And sort of finally, what does the resolution look like, both in sort of the short term of, say, negotiators coming back to the table, or a new valuation perhaps, but also what does it look like in the long term, over, say, the next year, couple of years, however long that would sort of take? What's the sort of, not end goal, because I understand that this kind of work it's a process, it's ongoing, it changes depending on what's needed, but sort of what are the long-term goals? You've sort of already touched on this, but just sort of if you could.
Okay, so again there are the two disputes. Around the pensions dispute, the short-term goal is to essentially stop the cuts that are due to come in next April, get back into the room and work out a sustainable model for the pensions. And so we would imagine that would take, some time with negotiations, its employers and the union coming together and finding a solution. And we think there is a solution. And a number of employers, including Birkbeck, also think there is a solution. We just have to get past this impasse. With the 4 fights, what we're asking for in immediate term is a pay increase, and that's a pay increase of £2,500 for all staff. The reason that we're doing it that way is because that pay increase would usually you do pay in terms of percentages, and so what ends up happening is effectively, the higher paid staff get a bigger pay increase relative to lower paid staff. Because part of the problem we have is we have staff who are incredibly low paid on casualized contracts. The reason we're talking about a blanket figure is that would disproportionately benefit them.
Yeah.
So if you're a professor who's on quite a lot of money, it's not going to look like that much. But if you're teaching modules on a casualized basis, the university is not paying you, more than, in the end, less than £10,000 a year. That's going to be a lot of money. So that's the reason for that. So that's immediate. Around the other issues, so casualization, workload inequalities, what we're asking for is for employers to agree collectively to implement a national framework that would aim to eliminate casualization, that would aim to eradicate the pay gaps that we have, and that would aim to get rid of excessive overworking. So we see that as agreeing for us and the employers to work towards all of those things getting better, because we understand that they're not going to change straight away. And the reason that we think that needs to be a national framework is that universities, like many other industries, do operate nationally. So, when you come to university and students obviously, think about where they're going to go, if you could be promised by one institution that you would be taught by kind of fully paid staff who would have, workload to really commit to doing your teaching, I mean, they could evidence that that teaching was better. More students would go there, other universities would follow suit. What we have at the moment is things going in the other direction, where universities essentially save money by cost cutting, and a lot of the way that they cost cut is by employing casualized staff, rather than paying people on full-term contracts, and we have kind of essentially a race to the bottom, So that's why we think it needs to be a national framework. And what that starts to look like for students, and I think it would start to change very quickly, is a number of things. I mean, firstly, you start to see, this feeds into projects around equalities, where you start to see, more women, more academics of color, more academics with registered disabilities, in the classroom, having the time to do that teaching, having the time to take up senior roles, to work with students, do things like masters and PhD supervision, so that's one thing. You start to see almost immediately an improvement in, the amount of contact hours you have. And I don't mean just kind of like, that you have longer classes necessarily, but, teaching staff and non-teaching staff have more ability and time to engage with students, because, casualized staff are on permanent contracts, permanent staff have lesser workloads. We can do things like give better and more detailed feedback on assessments. If you email a staff member, if you email your tutor, they're going to be able to reply to you because they work for the university more than 2 hours a week. Those kinds of things. So the quality of teaching gets better, but everything the university does around that teaching also gets better too. And we think if we start implementing those changes, you start to see those benefits quite quickly. The full benefits kind of come gradually down the road, but even students who are currently at university, should see in the next 6 to 12 months, things begin to change in terms of, their relationships with staff at university, and the kind of quality of teaching and learning and everything associated with that goes with it.
Sure, cool, thank you. So that was all the questions I had. Is there anything, before we go, is there anything that you would like to add that you think is important that we haven't covered yet, or I haven't asked?
No, I think, I mean, I just would say, that for us, this is partly about, basic things like pay and conditions, like being able to think, that I will be able to continue to live in London after I retire. It is about those basic things, but it's also about putting in place the structures that will allow us to do our jobs properly. And doing our jobs properly benefits students. The way that the university, and not just Birkbeck, but the way that universities across the UK are working at the moment is not the way that they could work. And I think students have experiences everywhere of feeling like staff don't have enough time for them, of feeling, as I said, that, they try to communicate, nothing comes back, of feeling like they're in overcrowded classrooms, of feeling like they're not getting enough contact time. It's not because staff across the university don't care. They do. It's because of these structural constraints. It's because some people are only employed to be on the institution's payroll kind of 4 hours a week. It's because other people, are working weekends and nights just to keep up with things. And a university that changed that would be a much better university for everyone.
Thank you so much, and thank you again for agreeing to come and talk to us today. I mean, obviously you're incredibly busy, so it's really appreciated. And yeah, thank you again.
No, thank you.